Good morning, everybody.
Good morning.
Good morning, yeah. Super excited that we have Nadine Strossen here with us. She is a free speech advocate, crusader, published author. She was president of the ACLU for a number of years. She actually is a professor emerita at my daughter's law school, which I'm pretty happy about. And we're able to do this through the Voices for Liberty. They actually had a grant that allowed Nadine to come out and speak at both campuses, so we're super grateful that they had that grant and that they allowed her to come out. And so this is just going to be pretty informal. We did a big event last night, and we're just going to do kind of a Q&A, and you guys can jump in any time. And the first question that I want to start with is, give me the pitch for free speech. Why do we need free speech?
Okay, well, before I answer your question,
Okay,
Professor, I'm going to exercise my free speech rights to thank you and your colleagues, including Sundial. I understand this is his class, and Alona, I think her class is here as well, and the students for hosting me and for your really impressive demonstrated commitment here on your campuses to free speech, intellectual pluralism, a diversity of viewpoints, and civil discourse. This is not something to be taken for granted on either campuses or, sadly, in our society as a whole. So many thanks and more power to all of you. I hope that you will keep developing and exercising your free speech rights, including the rights to debate and dissent and discuss, including with respect to me. I welcome very hard questions. I welcome arguments, counter arguments to my current thinking. That's the only way that I learn and grow. So this is always an ongoing educational experience for me. Let me just say one word about Voices for Liberty, because it's a fairly new organization and not that well known. It is a nonpartisan organization whose mission is directly connected to the answer to your question, Christy, so I'm getting there. It's committed to making people understand and carry forward the integral connection between freedom of speech and movements for justice. Whatever your view of justice, equality, public interest, the good society might be. Voices for Liberty is convinced, and I personally am convinced, that it cannot be carried forward without free speech. You know, yesterday a reporter asked me this very same question. It's an important question, and as I thought about the answer, I realized that freedom of speech is connected to absolutely everything about me and about you as individuals. And that means as individuals in and of ourselves, but also as individuals who hopefully are building relationships with other individuals. We can't, and including society at large, we can't do any of that without free speech. So first, starting at the individual level, how do you form your sense of identity, your sense of self, who you are in the world? You know, and now I think, have much more openness and fluidity about identity, you know, matters that used to be considered quite fixed, such as gender and sexual orientation, that these are matters to be explored, to be developed, to be revisited throughout our lifetimes. That involves a process of thinking, and the freedom to think integrally, it depends on the freedom to speak. You can't have one without the other. So the process of self-exploration and self-development, and that includes not only your sense of identity, but also your sense of beliefs. You know, what are my beliefs, either religious or philosophical? And these certainly can change and evolve through time, but you can't do that without freedom of speech. The Supreme Court, in a very important case probably about 20 years ago, in an opinion by Justice Kennedy, said freedom of thought is the beginning of all freedom, and freedom of speech is the beginning of freedom of thought. Many of us have heard that famous statement by the 17th century philosopher Rene Descartes, "I think, therefore I am." So you put those two sentences and thoughts together, those two ideas together. I speak, therefore I think, therefore I am. And am is not a permanent state. It's one that we're constantly developing and evolving, hopefully throughout our lifetimes. That's what education is all about. So that's the individual-centered benefit and necessity of free speech. But what about in terms of our relationships with others? How did we develop friendships? How did we develop and nurture romantic or loving or family relationships or collegial or professional relationships or educational, teacher-student, mentor-mentee, employee-employer? All of these relationships depend on communication. And it's a two-way street, right? And the Supreme Court has recognized that freedom of speech under the First Amendment involves not only the right of the speaker to convey information and ideas, but also the right of the listener to receive information and ideas, or to reject them, to decide I'm not going to listen to that person, or I'm not going to be persuaded by his or her idea. So even on the most intimate relationships, family and friendships and romantic partners depend on freedom of speech. But beyond that, any kind of group association, including a professional one, an educational one, a political one, our relationship to our government. We the people, to quote the opening words of the Constitution, we wield the sovereign power in this country. How do we do that other than by exchanging ideas with, receiving ideas from, responding to, criticizing those who are seeking to elect us in the political process? So I can't think of anything important, I can't think of anything, period, that does not depend on freedom of speech. If you can give me a counterexample, I'm all ears.
I can't, no. You're talking to someone who's passionate about freedom of speech, so.
You know, here in a film course, I should say, of course, although it may not be taken for granted, but for many years we have taken for granted that film, along with all the other art forms, does constitute a form of speech, which is protected under the First Amendment's free speech clause, which says Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech. And interestingly enough, when the movie industry was new, the very first case the Supreme Court had about it in 1915, when there were many censorship boards, film censorship boards all over the country, and that's what they called themselves. They were at the city level and at the state level, and you'd have a board of censors that would decide that certain films were so immoral that they would not be allowed to be shown. And in 1915 was the first time that the United States Supreme Court heard a case in which a film director, creator, distributor were challenging the power of these censorship boards. And the Supreme Court, without dissent, just said, you know, it's not expression, it's a business, it's not protected by the First Amendment. And it wasn't until several decades later, in the early 1950s, that the Supreme Court finally reversed that decision. So, you know, in the earliest days of my childhood, I was living in a country in which films were not considered protected expression. And interestingly enough, the case that went to the Supreme Court that led to its overturning that earlier decision involved a classic film by the great Italian director Roberto Rossellini. I don't know if you students study his work, but it was attacked. The Catholic Church at that time had a great deal of influence over both books and films. Even in, I guess because it was such a priority for the church, they had a dominant political power in many large cities, but even in other cities, their list of prohibited works was extremely influential. And not surprisingly, any film that was viewed to be irreverent from a traditional Catholic perspective was on the forbidden list. And Rossellini's film, I'm sorry I can't remember the name of it now, but it's clearly a modern interpretation of the story of Mary's pregnancy and the divine birth of Jesus. But Mary is a villager in a poor young woman in a small, impoverished rural village in Italy. She becomes pregnant out of wedlock, and she says it was an angel that visited her, and it's going to be the Son of God. And of course, she is mocked and pilloried and vilified, and stones are thrown at her, and she is driven out. She may ultimately even be stoned to death. But that was seen as being sacrilegious and blasphemous, and that's why the censors didn't allow it. But the Supreme Court overturned it.
Well, and I think that happened in the 80s and 90s with the record industry, with the music industry. They wanted to, I think it was Tipper Gore, Al Gore's wife, that wanted to label albums with explicit language that we talked a little bit about last night. And I don't know that movement, I don't know that there was a Supreme Court case that was tied to that.
There wasn't, Christy, for this reason, but it's such an important point, because what it illustrates is that every time there is a new communications medium that makes it easier and faster and cheaper to reach an audience, especially an audience of young people, society and government officials get very worried. I mean, civil libertarians and artists get very excited because this is a wonderful opportunity to communicate with more people more effectively. But those with a more authoritarian bent are concerned about the negative implications, the disinformation and the hate speech and the immoral expression that will become more available to our youth. And the music videos were a good example of that. And to make a point that is really important, regardless of what your view is on the political spectrum from left to right, these censorial pressures come from all across the spectrum. Sometimes the left and the right may disagree about which particular speech is dangerous or immoral or harmful. In this case, as you rightly say, the charge against violent and misogynistic lyrics in rap in particular, the charge against that was led by liberal women through an organization founded and headed by Tipper Gore, who was then married to Al Gore, who was then a senator, went on to become vice president and a Democratic presidential candidate. And it was called the names are always Parent Music Resource Council, right? It sounds so innocuous. And their initial goal was to have federal legislation that would outlaw the use of certain lyrics in rap. And by the way, where the conservative forces entered in, a lot of the rap lyrics had anti-police lyrics, because even back then,
thinking of one in particular,
before George Floyd, there was already a very big concern in African American neighborhoods in major cities that police, Los Angeles in particular, among others, were engaging in unjustified violence, including chokeholds and leading to unjustified deaths. So there was actually something called Cop Killer, is that the one you're thinking of? And police officers' unions with great support were campaigning to have those lyrics outlawed. And what ultimately happened is there was a compromise. And by the way, this is the compromise that affects the film industry as well, the so-called labeling and rating. All of that is done by the industry itself. But the reason that the industry agreed to put these ratings, and they keep changing, and forgive me, I don't remember what they are, like PG and PG-13 and X or NC-17. The reason why the industry voluntarily, I'm putting that in scare quotes, agreed to self-rating in the case of both music and film was just as a way to stop Congress from actually passing a law that would have involved outright censorship, and that is direct government censorship. Now, I do think that if the government censorship had gone into play, it would have been struck down as unconstitutional. So in some ways that makes the rating system worse, because you can't really bring a constitutional challenge when the industry is doing it voluntarily, although I would argue that it's not really voluntary. It was done under the shadow of government coercion. Now, some of you may say, what's the big deal about ratings? It's not stopping the movie from being produced. Again, I don't know how much you study this in any of your film courses, but there are many documented cases of films that would have been made that were not made because there's a certain rating that is the one that is commercially desirable. And forgive me, you may all know this, it's not the PG one, it's the one that's just above the banned category.
So the PG-13?
It's the one where it's got some shades of something risque to it, but not so much that it's outright banned. And so that really does have an influence in inhibiting the artistic freedom of choice of the creators. And there are a couple of filmmakers. I think the one that I've heard of the most is Pedro Almodovar from Spain, who has refused to go along with the suggested edits to get the permissible rating, and he's actually produced films that have the X rating. And I don't know, how he was able to do that, whether he was, willing to forego the money or somehow had access to it. But make no mistake about it, it does actually have the result that what I think should be unconstrained artistic judgments are being unduly influenced by these censorial movements from both the left and the right.
So we talked a little bit about this last night, but there's a growing movement, I think, among college campuses and really just overall, especially with cancel culture and this idea of woke, and there's a movement to limit some speech that is deemed offensive or hate speech. Can you talk a little bit about, what is protected under the First Amendment, what's not protected, and is this hate speech kind of, where does it fall? Because we're seeing that a lot right now.
And with apologies to Christy and anybody else who was there last night, this is a repeat. So in fact, I could press a button, you could answer the question, but
I'll let you, you're the expert.
So First Amendment law is very complicated. It has evolved over more than 100 years in hundreds and hundreds of Supreme Court cases. And let me just say this, the free speech clause in the First Amendment is very straightforward. It says, Congress shall make no law abridging the freedom of speech or of the press. Now, that may sound very straightforward, but when you think about it, every single word in there is subject to different interpretations. Starting with the word speech, I already gave you an example where it was debated and for a while decided that, for many decades, decided that speech didn't apply to film. And then there was a re-examination, and the justices decided it did extend to film. So what is speech? What is free speech? What is an abridgment? All of these words have been subject to a great deal of interpretation and reinterpretation and debate, which makes the law extremely complex, because what our law consists of are just this collection of judicial opinions, many of which are at least in tension with each other, if not outright inconsistent with each other. And those of us who are trying to explain it, understand it ourselves, and explain it to other people have to thread our way through this morass. And as a result of having done that for many years, which was crystallized in my book, I really came to appreciate that all of that complex law can really be boiled down, without oversimplifying it, into two major propositions. And these propositions accord completely with common sense. On the one hand, The government is permitted to outlaw the speech that is the most dangerous under something that's usually called the emergency principle. On the other hand, the government is not allowed to engage in the censorship that is the most dangerous under something called the viewpoint neutrality principle. So let me start with the viewpoint neutrality principle, because if I had to choose only one free speech principle to teach you, it would be that one, because the US Supreme Court has said repeatedly that is the bedrock principle underlying this whole complex edifice of First Amendment law. And viewpoint neutrality means this, that government may never restrict speech solely because of its viewpoint, solely because the viewpoint, the idea, the message, the content is offensive, is seen as evil, is seen as vaguely harmful or dangerous, is feared. If you dislike the viewpoint, if you even loathe the viewpoint, the response is not government censorship, but for you to raise your voice to argue against it. Or perhaps you think a more effective strategy is to turn your back and ignore it. But in other words, the response is for we, the people, to pick and choose the ideas we favor or disfavor, and not for the government to take those choices away from us. So that's the viewpoint neutrality principle. And censorship that violates that, where the government is putting its stamp of approval or its stamp of disapproval upon particular ideas, that is the most dangerous form of censorship in our system of government, because not only does it violate our individual liberty, it is completely inconsistent with this notion that we, the people, have the sovereign power. We are the ones who decide which ideas should be given support and which not. It is not for some powerful government official to dictate that to us. The complementary principle, the emergency principle, is also very commonsensical. According to that principle, when you get beyond the viewpoint, the content, the message of the speech, and you consider the speech in its overall context, all of the facts and circumstances in which it is uttered, then government may restrict the speech if, in that particular context, the speech directly causes or imminently threatens certain specific, serious harm. And the harm cannot be in your mind. It cannot be, I dislike the idea, or I'm offended by the expression, because that would violate the viewpoint neutrality principle. But if the harm is something tangible and concrete, such as you are going to be subject to physical violence imminently, or you are subject to targeted bullying right then, that satisfies the emergency principle. And let me give you just a few examples. The Supreme Court has recognized several categories, always context-defined categories of speech that do satisfy the emergency principle. So one is intentional incitement of imminent violent or lawless conduct, where the speaker intends to incite the imminent lawless or violent conduct. Another one, which I already alluded to, is when the speaker is targeting a particular individual or small group of individuals and harasses them and or intends to instill a reasonable fear that they are going to be subject to physical violence. That's a true threat or targeted harassment. So the law sensibly gives the government power to protect us against speech that directly causes specific harm, but not harm to our feelings. The fact that you are offended by the idea, insulted by the message, that's not good. I'm certainly not advocating that you exercise your freedom of speech in ways that are offensive to other people. But you have to understand that these concepts are so inherently subjective. What one person considers to be offensive somebody else can consider to be very positive. And especially in our very fraught, polarized, divided political climate, on the most important subjects, from abortion to police practices to issues about race and gender, we have people voicing their impassioned, deeply held, cherished beliefs about what is true and right and just and righteous, which other people can reject as being exactly the opposite. I mean, I think abortion illustrates that very well. I happen to be an advocate of reproductive freedom, as I call it, but I've debated people who consider abortion to be murder, and I have respect for their viewpoints in the sense that I understand, given their religious beliefs and their outlook on the world, why they see it that way. But I know that many others in the pro-choice camp would see that as anti-abortion advocacy, as hatred toward women, or dehumanizing toward women, whereas many in the pro-life camp see pro-choice advocacy as, hatred toward the unborn, or to people that have a different view on that issue. So, by all means, let's hopefully debate the issues, and in my perspective, let's look for paths forward that would be mutually beneficial, despite our disagreements on some of the issues. And I don't want to segue off into another topic altogether, but I think it would be not only counter to individual freedom, but counter to the necessity of finding a path forward on this really important issue of abortion, not to take it off the table under hate speech laws, because inevitably, if offensiveness is the standard, both pro-life and pro-choice positions are going to be subject to censorship, and that's just one of countless examples.
So for these college students coming into, the CMU campus, and what advice would you give them in terms of dealing with someone that has and maybe they have a very strong moral fiber and it's an opposing viewpoint? What advice would you give them in terms of dealing with that or having conversations? Because we talked a little bit about self-censorship in classes and not saying anything. But you're sitting at a table having lunch with someone new. They bring up something that's totally contrary to what you have grown up with. How do they approach that? How can they build that kind of civil discourse to kind of create a conversation rather than personal attacks?
Christy, before I try to give some advice to your students, let me just say what my basis and my own personal experience is, which is throughout my adult lifetime, I have debated just about every opponent of every civil liberties position. That I, for many years, was head of the ACLU, whose mission was not only to defend freedom of speech, but to do our best to defend all fundamental freedoms for all people. And so I would do debates on everything from A to Z, abortion, affirmative action, capital punishment, criminal justice, drug policy, LGBTQ rights, women's rights, you name it. Separation of church and state, religious liberty, and I was always debating very strong opponents on each issue, people who felt, and to me these are moral issues, and to them these are moral issues, and issues of central concern to all of us. And I cannot recall a single instance where that very strong disagreement on issues of great moral importance to both of us translated into personal animosity or hostility. To the contrary, I became very good friends with a number of people that I met through debating them. And I think probably the example that might be best known to the students is Antonin Scalia, who was for a long time a United States Supreme Court justice and the leader of the conservative wing of the Supreme Court, an ardent, devout Catholic We strongly disagreed on issues of abortion and LGBTQ rights, but we also disagreed very strongly about the role of the Supreme Court in general and the importance of individual rights protected by the court in general. And I like to say we became good friends not despite our disagreements, but because of our disagreements, which is the reason that we were brought together and traveled all over the world debating each other. First of all, I have never found an exception to this. No matter how strongly you disagree with somebody, no matter how many issues and no matter how important those issues are to you, you will find at least some other issues that are also deeply important to both of you where you strongly agree with each other. I have never found an exception to that. Number two, even on the issues where you strongly disagree, the disagreements, important as they are, and I don't mean to minimize it, I've spent my whole life debating these, but the issues where you disagree are relatively superficial. If you dig down deeper to what are the goals that you are trying to achieve through the positions that you're advocating, you will find agreement. So take abortion, for example. Reverence for life. We all share a reverence for life. There is obviously very strong disagreement about how what reproductive freedom people would say the fetus and what others would say the preborn child, how that factors into it. But at bottom, I think it's really worth celebrating what you share in common and use that as a bridge to try to build toward some solution that might be mutually acceptable to both of you. So I think what I'm illustrating through my own personal experience, Christy, is that you should never reduce any other human being to a single issue or even a single set of issues, any more than you would want to be so oversimplified in all of your individual complexity. And surely, in addition to, I dare say, we could randomly pair up any two people in the whole university and the whole universe, and you would find some issues of deep importance that you care about. But even beyond that, there would be some common interests. It might be sports, or it might be a hobby, or it might be traveling to some certain part of the world. And I think, to me, one of the sad things about the political polarization is that it is oversimplifying all of us as individuals, kind of boiling us down to, are you red or blue? Are you pro-Trump or are you anti-Trump? And it's depriving all of us of the rich complexity of all of the factors that make us a unique and interesting human being, and the opportunity to connect with some of those countless other factors in another person that make them an interesting and fascinating human being.
You guys have any questions as we're going through that you want to jump in on?
I got one.
Okay.
How do you perceive the role of social media platforms in facilitating free speech, and how has it changed with the recent accusation that Elon Musk has had over Twitter?
Thank you for that excellent question. So in some ways, the question answered itself, because you're talking about social media as a platform for disseminating whatever we human beings choose to disseminate. And as is the case with all platforms, they are simply a medium of communication, a mode of transition and of transmission. And what is transmitted depends on us, what we choose to purvey on the platform and what we choose to listen to, because the reception is obviously, to some extent, going to determine what's put up there in the first place. As the Supreme Court said in its first case, upholding the free speech protection for the internet. And let me take a pause there, because this goes back to my earlier point that every time there's a new communications medium, it is not taken for granted that it is going to be protected under the free speech clause of the First Amendment. And many young people are shocked to learn that when the internet had first burst upon the political and public and media radar screen, it was greeted with horror and alarm about the negative impact it would have on young people. The concern at the time was particularly about sexual predators getting access to young kids. We were in the midst of what cultural observers have now called a moral panic, and I hope it goes without saying, but I'll say it. One exploitation of one child is far too many, but there was an exaggerated sense of how great this danger was, and therefore an overreaction in terms of legislative proposals, one of which was the first federal law governing the internet, called the Communications Decency Act. It sailed through Congress. Almost nobody voted against it on either side of the aisle. It was supported enthusiastically by the Clinton administration, and it would have outlawed online any expression that was deemed to be, and I'm going to use quotation marks because this was the actual statutory language, indecent or patently offensive. Now just think of how subjective those terms are, examples of how they have been used against any kind of expression that has anything to do with sexuality. The ACLU, I'm proud to say, brought the lawsuit that successfully challenged that law. And to give you a sense of what we saved from being banished from the internet, our clients included women's rights organizations, organizations dealing with abortion, Stop Prisoner Rape, Human Rights Watch, because they were documenting rape used as a tool of war and oppression around the world. But we also represented mainstream booksellers and publishers and the American Library Association. We represented ourselves because our own website with information about subjects from sexual orientation to reproductive freedom to censorship contained material that had been denounced as indecent. And that case went down in history as Reno, Janet Reno was the Attorney General under Bill Clinton, versus ACLU. Fortunately, the Supreme Court 9-0 struck down the law, and Josh, one of its great statements was that they were thereby preserving the internet as the most mass participatory form of communication the world had ever known. In other words, the unique benefit was that instead of these powerful few gatekeepers, the major TV broadcasters and newspaper publishers, which were just publishing a tiny amount of material, on the internet, at least in theory, every single one of us could have a platform to communicate with every single other one of us. Now, with the advent of social media, there have emerged this new category of gatekeepers, those who are rich and powerful enough to buy the social media platforms, and they are engaging in content moderation, which nobody is pleased with, not surprisingly. Some people say they're taking off too much stuff, other people say they're not taking off enough stuff, and you know, one of the few things that Biden and Trump agreed upon last time they ran against each other, and I dare say it's going to continue to be true, was that they both objected to the content moderation practices of the powerful social media companies, but they just disagreed. Trump thought that too much conservative material was coming down, and Biden thought not enough conservative material is coming down. And as you probably know, Josh, maybe your students do too, there's a really important case before, a pair of cases before the Supreme Court right now, which is challenged, where the internet companies and civil libertarians are challenging two state laws that have restricted content moderation powers by the social media platforms. I think that from judging from the Supreme Court oral argument a week or two ago, I think the court is going to strike down those laws and is going to say that the power to engage in content moderation is a First Amendment right that is being exercised by these companies just the way that Time Magazine or Fox News, whatever traditional media you're looking at, makes its own determinations free of government compulsion as to which views and speakers to air and which ones not to air. That leaves a very serious question, given the practical power and domination that these platforms have. It's deeply disturbing that they're not subject to any First Amendment limitations on discriminating against particular view. I mean, that's another way of describing the editorial function, right? They are engaging in the kind of viewpoint discrimination that the government itself would not be allowed to engage in. And I think we really have to look for other solutions to that problem, including encouraging the proliferation of many other media platforms, social media platforms with very different approaches to gatekeeping.
I think in looking at that, and we talked about this last night, the public square, it used to be truly a public square, and now we have these public carriers. And it'll be interesting to see, I think, is Biden versus Missouri, or I think that's the case that we were talking about. But it's going to be interesting because, you know, when Twitter, under the previous ownership, when they actually banned Donald Trump, I can tell you that, I mean, there were just shockwaves. I had a lot of friends that were applauding it, you know, that they were excited that President Trump was banned, and I said, but it's going to switch. You watch. I mean, you have to be careful about what you're cheering on.
May I say something?
Yeah,
about that?
absolutely.
Let me tell you, I have many critiques against Donald Trump as a civil libertarian. You won't be surprised, but that was completely irrelevant to my completely negative reaction to his deplatforming, because I always look at the underlying principle. And, you know, at that point, my view was, and it remains, that Donald Trump, well, let me put it this way, Mark Zuckerberg, because he was also kicked off Facebook, is much more powerful than Donald Trump ever was or ever could be, unless he becomes a dictator as he's threatened. But in all seriousness, think about it. Donald Trump, as a government official, was subject to the First Amendment. He could be sued for violating the First Amendment, and he was sued multiple times under the First Amendment. But Mark Zuckerberg, as the owner of a private sector platform, is not subject to First Amendment constraints at all. To the contrary, has his own First Amendment rights, including to kick off Donald Trump. Donald Trump was subject to impeachment, and he was impeached, but nobody can impeach Mark Zuckerberg. Donald Trump was subject to not being reelected, and most of us think he was not reelected, but nobody can unelect Mark Zuckerberg. So there's something deeply disturbing in terms of the power dynamics in our society, that we have these platform controllers who are not subject to any of the usual checks and balances that constrain even our commander-in-chief. And the only thing that I would say, Christy, is again looking at the positive side of social media, because you know we do tend to concentrate on problems, which is fine because we're looking for solutions. But having grown up in the pre-internet era, unlike most of the people here, I will never for 1 second take for granted what all of you take for granted now, and that is the enormous, unprecedented access to ideas and information that is so accessible to you on your little handheld computer that you call a phone, and your ability to communicate with each other. And, you know, from a progressive perspective, a civil libertarian perspective, let me say, how many movements had existed before but never got traction, never took off until there was the power of social media to propel them. I already alluded to the long ago movement against unjustified police violence, especially disproportionately against young black men. I mean, I've been fighting that struggle since I got out of law school in the 1970s, and it wasn't until the power of social media drove those images around the world that the Black Lives Matter movement took off. Same thing about sexual violence. Of course there have been opposition and movements to oppose sexual harassment and sexual assault forever. But they didn't really get traction until the Me Too movement launched by social media. And one final example, which is the unprecedented number of young, female, LGBTQ, immigrant, racial minorities, ethnic minorities, religious minorities who are running for office, who no longer have to depend on these really powerful, constricting gatekeepers of the traditional broadcast media. In the past, until social media came along, if you couldn't afford the enormous fees for television advertising, you couldn't make headway as a candidate. So there's a great deal of positive, and I think we have to look to create alternative platforms to give us even more choice for everybody, regardless of our perspectives.
Any other questions out there?
What recommendations do you have for aspiring filmmakers who want to explore challenging or taboo subjects while respecting the principles of free speech and artistic integrity?
I think I missed the middle part of your question, because what advice for filmmakers who want to explore, was it challenging topics while exercising free speech? So what's the countervailing concerns would be possible censorship pressures, possible lack of financing. Would those be the obstacles?
Could be within even like the classroom, like.
Oh,
You know what I mean?
Okay. I hear what, so forgive me, I'm not quite getting the question, but you can give me a follow-up question. I think, you know, what you're launching in my head is a really important point that I made yesterday, so please bear with me, it really bears repeating. That even if you have freedom of speech as a legal matter or as a policy matter, it's still not easy to exercise in the real world, given our understandable and to some extent laudable concerns about the reactions of the members of our community. Now obviously on some scale, if you're going to produce a film that people hate and they're not going to watch, that's kind of a self-defeating proposition, so you always have to be aware of that. But I think what I hear Josh alluding to is something that I don't know how present it is here, but on campuses around the country, every survey has shown that students are engaging in rampant self-censorship, not addressing certain topics at all, not only through film, but through conversation, not because the government says, we're going to punish you if you do that, not because you're afraid your professor is going to give you a bad grade if you do that, but because you're afraid that fellow classmates, sister classmates, are going to see what you were saying or what you're expressing as offensive or insensitive. This goes back to Christy's question. And you know, it's nice of us, it's positive that we don't want to hurt other people's feelings. We don't want to be insensitive to them. That's positive and should be applauded. And I understand that people of your age have gone through school where you have been appropriately sensitized to concerns about bullying and respect for the equal dignity and worth of everybody else. That is very, very positive and not something that I at all take for granted. But as with every good thing, it can go too far if it results in your not exploring certain ideas, as you say, challenging ideas. And so there's an organization of which I'm a senior fellow called FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. For the last 4 years, FIRE, working together with College Pulse, has done an extremely detailed survey of campuses around the country, and I think that your campus was not included, but I'll have to, I mean, there are 13, something like 1,300 colleges and universities in the United States, and this included 248, so most were not included, but it was a scientifically selected sample. And it shows that on all of these campuses, about at least 50% of students say they cannot have a frank and candid conversation about a whole range of really important but sensitive subjects, and that they can't have that conversation in class, but they also can't have that conversation, in the student cafeteria with fellow students because of these concerns. The number one subject that people were afraid to discuss, which is why I deliberately used it as an example earlier, abortion. In a situation where the Supreme Court has recently overturned Roe versus Wade, and states and localities all over the country are, and including at the national level, are debating issues of abortion policy, that this is the number one issue that more than 50% of students say I cannot candidly and frankly discuss. So, I mean, you would be in good company if you said, I can't candidly make a film that explores these issues because I'm going to be accused of being insensitive or offensive, maybe from both ends of the spectrum. The second most sensitive topic that college students couldn't address was gun control or gun policy. And after that, it was race and police practices, and then transgender issues. So, I guess I've just elaborated on the problem. What is the solution? The solution really has to come from you, students, because what you are afraid of, who you are afraid of, is each other. Faculty members come out very well in these surveys. Students say, we're fair. They're not afraid of us discriminating on the basis of your viewpoints. They really don't care about us, but what they do care about are each other. And so somehow you have to create trust among yourselves. I know one strategy that some schools are using is what's called Chatham House rules, which means what is said in class stays in class. So phones are confiscated or put aside so that nobody can document what happens in class, and with the chance of taking something out of context and making it go viral. That may be a help. And there may be exercises that can take place even before you start taking classes through the orientation program, of instilling in you the importance of, yes, being respectful and civil as much as you can to each other, but not to the extent that you're not going to say something just because you think it offends somebody and will offend somebody. We have to take it on good faith with each other that we're here to pursue truth. And we can't do that unless we freely and frankly exchange views, and we're going to be warned in advance that some of those views are going to be offensive to our most deeply held beliefs. And also, we have to be warned in advance that our most deeply held beliefs are going to be offensive to somebody else. So maybe that kind of pre-preparation could help. But I'd love to bounce that question back to any of you. I know you've thought about this a lot. What do you think could be done and should be done in your classes or elsewhere? Since you asked the question, well, Do you have any ideas? Okay.
Anybody else with a question? I think
Or an answer.
we've got, yeah.
You kind of went over content of free speech, but is there any limitations on time and place? Like if protesters came in now and stopped you from speaking, is that covered?
Thank you so much. So far I've given you 2 principles of free speech. And if I had had time, that would have been my 3rd one. So thank you so much for raising it. It's another example of content neutral, viewpoint neutral restrictions which are permissible. So if I can back up, the emergency standard is content neutral, right? The government is not allowed to restrict speech that poses an emergency because of its content. It's allowed to impose those restrictions because the content in the particular context poses an emergency. The other major category of content neutral and hence permissible restrictions is often referred to as content neutral time, place, and manner restrictions. So government isn't telling you what you may say or what you may not say, but it is putting limits on when, where, and how you convey that message. So no matter what the message is in a classroom space that has been dedicated to a particular educational experience, you may not say anything about any other topic that is going to be inconsistent with that dedicated use of that space. So here, nobody could stand up or should be allowed to stand up and start pontificating for or against any topic that is beyond the assigned topic of free speech and free thought. And a classic example would be sound trucks are not allowed to blare their messages late at night in a residential neighborhood, regardless of what that message is. And unfortunately, we've been seeing on many campuses, I gather this hasn't afflicted your campus yet, but on many others, we have seen very noisy disruptions and obstructions of, especially in the wake of the October 7th Hamas attack and Israel's response, where noisy groups of protesters are marching into classrooms, disrupting the teaching, holding forth in libraries and interfering with students' attempts to peacefully study in libraries, or even in a public area of campus, obstructing sidewalks, making it difficult or impossible for students and faculty members to walk to and from class. All of those kinds of interferences with other people's free speech rights and with the educational process should be subject to restriction. As we often see, the pendulum swings, and there were a lot of complaints that a lot of campuses were not enforcing content neutral time, place, and manner restrictions. So now many of them have gone to the other extreme and are imposing very, very severe limits, such as no indoor demonstrations at all, ever, or no posters at all, ever, in any dormitory or residential facility. I should say that the government does not get a completely free hand with content neutral time, place, and manner restrictions. They have to be narrowly tailored, and they have to leave ample alternative channels for communication. So it goes too far to say we're going to ban absolutely all indoor demonstrations or posters. Thank you.
I think we have time for one more question.
So kind of going back to what you were talking about with the issues of social media and the kind of sensorial nature of content moderation on there, I noticed that a lot of social media, specifically Twitter before Musk took over, were taking advantage of having kind of a tag that would either clarify a statement or give context or something like that. Do you think things like that when it comes to free speech, and I'm thinking in particular around free speech when it comes to factually inaccurate statements made on like public platforms. Like if you're driving around here, there's a lot of these anti-abortion signs that have extremely factually inaccurate information about the process of pregnancy and birth on them. Is just allowing stuff like that is factually inaccurate to kind of go around in the world, being spoken in public places, stuff like that, without a contextualization, where does that intersect with like free speech, would be my question.
Great question, and although you started with social media, you segued to the question more broadly, so I'll start with that. What's called disinformation or misinformation more broadly. And the emergency and viewpoint neutrality principles do apply to disinformation and misinformation as well as other kinds of controversial speech. So the mere fact that speech is false or misleading is not a justification for censoring it. But in particular contexts, certain false information that demonstrably, imminently causes or threatens certain specific harm can be censored. So before I go on to the larger category that may not be restricted, let me start with the most important examples of false or misleading speech that may be restricted. These will all be familiar concepts to you. One is defamation. When you intentionally or recklessly say something false about somebody that damages that person's reputation and leads to demonstrable injury, usually economic or financial injury. Another good example is fraud. When you intentionally make a false statement or misleading statement that you intend somebody to rely on to their detriment, they do that, they incur a financial or other tangible loss. They may be sued for fraud, and that's even a criminal situation in some cases. And the other most important example is perjury, when you lie in a court of law and undermine due process of law and the rule of law. But beyond that, the concept of disinformation is inherently subjective. To use the term that Donald Trump used, fake news. It's interesting to me that the conservatives tend to use the term fake news, the liberals tend to use the term disinformation, but it's the same content, which basically boils down to what I don't think is true and what I think is dangerous, and that is exactly how laws against disinformation and misinformation have been used around the world throughout history. Government selectively punishes those who are expressing views that are inconsistent with the government's own policy. And most of what we object to as disinformation is not a matter of objectively verifiable or falsifiable facts. I'd be very interested to take a look at the examples that you cited. But most of the examples involve some admixture of analysis and opinion or emphasis. It's not just, the earth is flat. I mean, the baldly falsifiable statements are not likely to do any harm. We're not really interested in them because people know that they're false. But when you look at the fact that what we are concerned about is some admixture of analysis and opinion, as well as a fact, that presents a problem that the Supreme Court well summarized when it said government may not be the arbiter of truth. In this country, there is no such thing as a false, punishable opinion. We have no need for Orwell's Ministry of Truth in this country, and referring to 1984. Social media companies and others, I would say, are well within their free speech rights to try to do fact-checking and to put labels, but I think there's a lot of debate about those labels as well, and so, I think what we have to do as responsible consumers and purveyors of information is to be on guard that everything we read is subject to question, and I mean everything. Somebody recently, a journalist recently asked me, do you regularly read a media outlet or look at a media outlet? that presents views that are different from your own? I said, yeah, every single one, starting with the New York Times and National Public Radio, but everything across the political spectrum. The more you know about a subject, the more you realize that there are, at best, unintended inaccuracies or oversimplifications, and at worst, outright fabrication and sins of omission, as well as inclusion. And one of the virtues of the internet, again, is that it makes it unprecedentedly easy for us to engage in our own fact-checking and looking at, what I love to do on the internet is look at original sources, not take any third party's account at face value, but dig into the bare facts myself.
We were talking about this on the drive over, and the one thing I think we can encourage college students is you guys really need to not just listen to sound bites. I think the average thing that, I want to say it's like 4.2 seconds of news that you just look at the title and then you form an opinion based on the title of an article. And you really, like Nadine said, you have to look further than that. You have to look at multiple sources. In my American Gov classes, we don't give opinions. We give facts, and then we have opinions about those facts. And so if there's anything I think both of us can encourage you to do is really look beyond the surface. That's what you guys have to do with all of this, and I think COVID came out too. There was a lot of misinformation, disinformation, and it's really up to you guys to not just look at one article for 4.2 seconds, but to really read about it. And it's easy not to because we're distracted by so many other things in the world. And so I would really encourage you guys to do that. I want to thank Nadine for our time together today. And she's going to be on the main campus as well. And yeah, you guys can clap for her. Her latest book on free speech, Everything You Need to Know, it's a great read. And if you want to have these kind of hard conversations with people and talk about free speech, I would really encourage you to take a look at it. The other thing I'm going to ask you guys to do, and this is the first time it's ever been done, but if you will do, there's a QR code in the back that Academic Affairs would like to do, just a quick assessment. It's like 5 questions, just based for you guys, that I would really appreciate if you guys would do that. So one more hand for Nadine, and thank you guys for coming.